London, May 1817. The chandeliers of Helmsley House blazed with 500 candles. Their light reflected off crystal drops that threw dancing rainbows across the polished marble floor. The ballroom held 150 guests, the cream of London society gathered for the season's most anticipated event. The air was heavy, carrying the stifling heat of the crowded room mingled with the scents of beeswax, expensive perfumes, and hothouse roses arranged in towering silver urns. Miss Penelope Wright stood in the shadows near the refreshment table, invisible as she had learned to be over 6 years of service as companion to the Dowager Countess of Helmsley. At 24, Penelope had perfected the art of stillness, of making herself so small and unobtrusive that guests looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. Her gown, a simple dove grey muslin, appropriate to her station, bore no adornment save a single silver ribbon at the waist, a remnant from better days. She refilled crystal cups with champagne punch, her movements practiced and efficient, while around her the glittering assembly danced and laughed and schemed. And in the centre of it all, holding court with his customary arrogance, stood Viscount Ravenscroft, tall and commanding in black evening dress, his cravat tied with careless perfection. If stories of impossible promises and the courage to claim what society denies touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Have you ever witnessed such tedium? Henry Beaumont drawled to his companion, Lord Marcus Fairfax, as they surveyed the ballroom with matching expressions of ennui. 3 hours of watching simpering misses parade their accomplishments, each more insipid than the last. Marcus chuckled, raising his champagne glass in acknowledgement. Your cynicism grows more pronounced each season, Ravenscroft. One might think you actively enjoy your reputation as London's most unmarriageable nobleman. Unmarriageable by choice, Henry corrected, his grey eyes scanning the room with the detached interest of a predator surveying prey. At 30 years of age, he had attended enough social gatherings to know precisely how the evening would unfold. The same faces, the same conversations, the same desperate mothers pushing their daughters forward like soldiers into battle. The champagne had loosened his tongue and sharpened his cruelty, deepening a dark, alcohol-fueled melancholy that frequently led to regrettable decisions. Tonight would prove no exception. It was then that his gaze fell upon the grey figure near the refreshment table. So still she might have been part of the woodwork itself. The Dowager's companion, he realized, a woman he had observed perhaps a dozen times over the years without truly seeing her. She moved with quiet efficiency, her head bowed, her entire posture suggesting a desperate wish to disappear entirely. Something in Henry stirred, something dark and restless that fed on the champagne coursing through his veins. An idea formed, cruel and calculated, the sort of entertainment that would enliven an otherwise tedious evening. Fairfax, he murmured, his lips curving into a smile that held no warmth. I believe I shall perform a public service this evening. That creature by the punch bowl, the Dowager's shadow. What say you to a bit of sport? Marcus followed his gaze, frowning slightly. That is Miss Wright, I believe. Harmless enough. What manner of sport did you have in mind? Watch and learn, my friend. Henry set down his glass and began moving across the ballroom with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he desired. The orchestra had just completed a country dance, and couples were returning to their positions around the perimeter of the floor. Henry calculated his movements with precision, arriving at the refreshment table just as a lull fell over the nearby conversations. Miss Wright, he said loudly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieter space. How delightful to finally make your formal acquaintance. Penelope's head snapped up, her brown eyes widening in alarm. She had learned long ago that attention from gentlemen of rank rarely boded well for women in her position. Her fingers tightened on the crystal ladle she held, her hands clenching until the knuckles turned white. My lord, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. May I serve you some refreshment? How kind, Henry replied, accepting the cup she poured with trembling hands. But I find myself in want of something far more entertaining than punch. The next dance, I believe, is to be a waltz. Around them, guests began to take notice. Conversations faltered and died as more and more people turned to observe the curious scene of Viscount Ravenscroft engaging the Dowager's invisible companion in conversation. "A waltz, my lord?" Penelope's voice remained steady, despite the fear that had begun to coil in her stomach. She knew that tone, that particular quality of aristocratic amusement that preceded humiliation. "Indeed." Henry's smile broadened, and he raised his voice further, ensuring that every ear in the vicinity could hear his next words. "I find myself seized by a sudden impulse toward generosity, Miss Wright. You have served my cousin's household with such devoted invisibility these many years. Surely you deserve some small recognition." The crowd was gathering now, drawn by the spectacle like moths to flame. Lady Constance Hartwell, Henry's cousin and a beauty who had long considered herself destined to become Viscountess Ravenscroft, moved closer with predatory interest. The Dowager Countess herself appeared at the edge of the gathering, her ancient face creasing with concern. Henry continued, his words falling like hammer blows in the suddenly silent ballroom. "I propose a wager, Miss Wright. A challenge, if you will. Dance the next waltz with me, here, in the center of this assembly. Dance it perfectly without a single misstep, and I shall reward you most handsomely." "My lord, I do not think," Penelope began, but stopped abruptly as Henry cut her off with a theatrical gesture. "Do not think, my dear Miss Wright. Simply listen. If you dance this waltz without error, if you manage to complete the entire set with the grace and precision expected of a lady, then I, Henry Beaumont, Viscount Ravenscroft, shall marry you." Chaos broke loose in the ballroom. Gasps, shocked laughter, and delighted whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Lady Constance's face transformed from curiosity to fury in an instant. The Dowager Countess pressed a hand to her bosom, appearing on the verge of collapse, and Penelope Wright stood frozen, the crystal ladle still gripped in her white fingers, staring at the man who had just turned her life into a public joke. But something unexpected happened in that moment of frozen horror. Something inside Penelope, compressed by years of silence and diminishment, cracked open. She thought of her father, Arthur Wright, who had been the finest dancing master in London before consumption and poverty had stolen his life. She remembered the countless hours he had schooled her in technique, his patient voice correcting her posture, adjusting her hand positions, teaching her the mathematics of movement that transformed mere steps into art. She remembered the afternoon he died, holding her hand in the cramped room above a tobacconist's shop, whispering that she must never forget what he had taught her, that grace and skill were possessions no one could take away. "You will mock me either way, my lord," Penelope said, and her voice, when it emerged, held a clarity that surprised even herself. "If I refuse, you shall laugh at my cowardice. If I accept and fail, you shall laugh at my presumption. So I choose the path that honors my father's memory." She set down the ladle with deliberate care, straightened her spine, and looked Henry Beaumont directly in his aristocratic face. "I accept your wager, Lord Ravenscroft, and when I dance this waltz without error, you shall be bound by your word as a gentleman to honor your promise." The ballroom fell utterly silent. Henry, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, was bereft of a ready response. He had expected tears, refusal, or stammering acceptance followed by immediate failure. He had not expected this quiet dignity, this steel beneath the grey muslin. "Well then," he managed, recovering his composure with effort, "let us see what the Dowager's shadow can accomplish when thrust into the light. Orchestra, if you please. A waltz." The musicians, well trained in the art of providing entertainment for their employers, struck up a lively German waltz. The crowd parted, forming a wide circle that enclosed the center of the ballroom. No one else took to the floor. This was to be a performance, a spectacle, a public humiliation set to music. Henry extended his hand with exaggerated courtesy, certain that the moment had arrived when Miss Wright would recognize her folly and flee. But Penelope stepped forward, placed her gloved hand in his, and allowed him to lead her to the center of the polished floor. What happened next would be discussed in London drawing rooms for years to come. As the waltz began, Henry placed his hand at Penelope's waist, assuming the proper position with the casual arrogance of a man who had danced 1,000 waltzes with 100 different partners. He prepared to lead, to subtly throw her off balance to ensure that the entertainment reached its inevitable conclusion. But the moment the music truly began, the moment Penelope's feet began to move, Henry realized with dawning shock that he was not leading this dance. She was. Not overtly, not in any way that violated the proper form, but through a mastery of technique so complete that she anticipated his movements before he made them, her body flowing through the positions with geometry made graceful. Her posture was flawless, her frame maintaining the exact degree of resistance that allowed her to move with him while remaining utterly centered in her own balance. Henry, accustomed to partners who clung and stumbled and required constant correction, danced with someone who moved as if the music flowed through her veins. Her feet never faltered, her turns were executed with textbook perfection, and her expression remained serene despite the 150 pairs of eyes fixed upon her. Around the ballroom, the laughter had died. Guests watched in stunned silence as the grey shadow they had ignored for 6 years transformed before their eyes into someone altogether different. This was not the clumsy performance of an untrained servant. This was art. Henry's own technique, considered adequate for a gentleman of rank, suddenly felt rough and uncertain next to her practiced grace. He worked harder than he ever had in a waltz, not to lead but simply to keep pace with her silent mastery. The music swelled and turned, carrying them through the intricate patterns of the dance. Penelope's grey skirts swirled with each rotation. There was no applause, only a profound, stunned silence where the only sounds were the music and the rustle of silk and muslin, emphasizing their isolation in the center of the room. Henry led her through the closing sequence, his mind racing as he struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. This had been meant as cruel sport, a momentary entertainment at the expense of someone too insignificant to matter. But Miss Wright had not merely accepted his challenge, she had won. The final notes faded. A heavy silence hung in the air. Henry looked at her, feeling the first physical sickener of regret coil in his stomach before she even moved. Penelope executed a perfect curtsy, her eyes meeting his with an expression he could not quite read. Not triumph, but something quieter and far more devastating. Dignity. "Thank you for the dance, my lord," she said softly. Before he could formulate a response, she turned and walked calmly through the parted crowd, her head held high, and disappeared through the doorway that led to the servants' quarters. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Lady Constance Hartwell's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Well, cousin, I do hope you enjoyed your jest, though I must say it was in rather poor taste even for you." Henry turned to find her standing nearby, her beautiful face twisted with an emotion he did not immediately recognize as jealousy. Behind her, a cluster of young ladies whispered behind their fans, their eyes bright with malicious glee. "My dear Constance," Henry began, but she interrupted him with a laugh that held no humor. "Do not address me as my dear, Henry. You have just promised marriage to a penniless companion in front of half of London society. Your mother will be absolutely delighted, I am sure, as will your solicitors, when they attempt to explain how you can possibly extricate yourself from a promise made before so many witnesses." The truth of her words settled over Henry like a shroud. He had been drunk on champagne and boredom, and in his arrogance he had created a situation from which there might be no elegant escape. Lord Marcus appeared at his elbow, his expression grave. "Ravenscroft, old friend, I believe you may have miscalculated rather severely. That was not the performance of an amateur. Where did the dowager's companion learn to dance like that?" "I have no earthly idea," Henry muttered, watching the doorway through which Penelope had vanished. "But I suspect I'm about to find out." The Dowager Countess of Helmsley materialized before him with surprising speed for a woman of her advanced years. Her wrinkled face was pale with fury, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who had moved in the highest circles for over 60 years. "Lord Ravenscroft, you will attend me in my private sitting room immediately. We shall discuss what is to be done about this appalling situation." It was not a request. 3 days passed before Henry saw Penelope Wright again, 3 days during which London society, talked of nothing but the extraordinary waltz and the impossible promise. The story grew with each telling, acquiring embellishments and details that bore little resemblance to reality. But the core remained unchanged. Viscount Ravenscroft had publicly promised marriage to a nobody, and she had met his challenge with devastating success. Henry's mother, the formidable Dowager Viscountess Ravenscroft, had descended upon his townhouse in Belgrave Square within hours of the ball, her fury so pronounced that even the butler had paled at her entrance. "You will retract this ridiculous promise," she had declared, her voice echoing through the marble entrance hall. "You will issue a public statement explaining that you were intoxicated and spoke in jest. The girl will be compensated for any embarrassment, and we shall weather whatever scandal results with the dignity befitting our name." But Henry, to his own surprise, had refused. Not because he intended to honor his promise, he told himself. Certainly not because something in Miss Wright's performance had unsettled him in ways he did not fully understand. He refused because to retract now would make him appear not merely cruel but cowardly, and Henry Beaumont, for all his faults, had never been accused of cowardice. "I shall decide how to proceed in my own time, Mother," he had said coldly. "For now, I suggest we allow the excitement to fade naturally. Society has a remarkably short memory when more interesting scandals arise to claim their attention." But society, it seemed, was not prepared to let this particular scandal fade. On the fourth day after the ball, Henry received a visit from his cousin Constance. She arrived at his townhouse unannounced, having left her maid standing in the hallway to maintain a shred of propriety, while she swept into his study with the confidence of someone granted liberties by long association. "Henry," she said, settling into the chair opposite his desk uninvited, "we must speak plainly, you and I, about this unfortunate situation." "Must we?" Henry remained seated behind his desk, deliberately not rising to greet her. "I was under the impression that I had made my position quite clear to my mother, who I am certain shared it with you in comprehensive detail." Constance's beautiful face arranged itself into an expression of concern that might have been convincing to someone who knew her less well. "I come not to scold, but to assist. You have been trapped, my dear cousin, by a clever schemer, and I have discovered information that may provide your escape." That caught his attention. "What manner of information?" "About Miss Penelope Wright and her unfortunate family history." Constance smoothed her expensive silk gown with practiced grace. Her father was Arthur Wright, a dancing master who once taught some of the better families. "But did you know that he died under a cloud of financial disgrace? There were accusations of gambling debts, of borrowing money from his students' families and failing to repay. Some even whispered that he took payments for lessons never delivered." Henry leaned back in his chair, studying his cousin's face. "And you learned this how, precisely?" "I have allies among the older servants," Constance said smoothly. "Those who remember when Arthur Wright was in demand, before his reputation crumbled. The man died penniless, Henry, leaving his daughter without resources or connections. Is it any wonder she leapt at your jest? She saw opportunity where you saw entertainment." "You believe she deliberately performed well to trap me into marriage?" "I believe she is far cleverer than she appears," Constance replied. "That grey gown, that demure manner, the perfect performance at precisely the right moment. She has been trained, Henry. Trained to insinuate herself into households, to wait for opportunity, to seize it when it presents itself. And now she has you precisely where she wants you." Henry was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "That is a remarkable tale you have constructed, Constance. One might almost admire the thoroughness of it." "I merely present facts," she said, her blue eyes wide with false innocence. "What you do with them is your choice, of course. But if you wish to extricate yourself from this situation with your reputation intact, I suggest you expose Miss Wright's background before she can claim some deeper connection to legitimacy." After Constance departed, Henry remained in his study for over an hour, staring at nothing in particular. His cousin's story had the ring of careful construction, of half-truths arranged to create a specific impression, but it had also raised questions that Henry found himself unable to dismiss. Who was Penelope Wright? Where had she learned to dance with such precision? And more importantly, Why did he find himself unable to simply dismiss her as his mother and cousin urged? That evening, Henry made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. He sent a note to his solicitor, requesting a comprehensive investigation into the Wright family history. But he also did something else, something that surprised even himself. He began attending the same social events where he knew the Dowager Countess would bring her companion. The following week brought 3 such occasions: a musicale at Lady Harrington's townhouse, a garden party at the Duke of Somerset's estate in Richmond, and a small dinner party hosted by Lord and Lady Blackwell. At each event, Henry observed Penelope Wright from a distance, watching how she moved through rooms like a ghost, how she anticipated her mistress's needs before they were spoken, how she made herself invisible with practiced skill. But he also noticed other things. The way certain guests would deliberately jostle her in doorways, forcing her to step aside or risk collision. The cruel laughter that followed her when she passed too close to groups of young ladies. The servants who treated her with barely concealed contempt, that particular disdain that those who serve often reserve for those they perceive as fallen from grace. At the musicale, he witnessed a particularly ugly scene. Lady Constance, holding court among a circle of her admirers, raised her voice just as Penelope passed nearby. "One must wonder," Constance said, her words carrying clearly across the drawing room, "what manner of training allows a woman to dance so expertly while performing the duties of a companion? Perhaps her education included skills beyond the respectable. Dancing masters, I am told, sometimes taught more than steps to those willing to pay." The implication hung in the air like poison. Penelope's step faltered for just a moment, the only sign that she had heard, before she continued on her way without turning her head. Henry, standing near the doorway, felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Anger, but not directed at Penelope Wright. He crossed the room before he had consciously decided to move, positioning himself deliberately in Constance's line of sight. "My dear cousin," he said pleasantly, his voice pitched to carry to the same ears that had heard her insinuation, "I was unaware that you had become such an expert on the training of dancing masters. One might think you had personal experience in the matter, though I cannot imagine any respectable teacher accepting a student of such wavering application." Constance's face flushed scarlet. The ladies surrounding her gasped, and Henry offered them all a small bow before continuing on his way, leaving chaos in his wake. He did not see the expression on Penelope's face as she observed this exchange from her position in the corner of the room, did not see the flicker of surprise that crossed her features, or the way her hand rose briefly to her throat as if to calm a suddenly racing pulse. But others noticed, and they remembered. The garden party at Richmond proved even more enlightening. The weather had turned warm and fine, and the Duke's grounds provided ample space for guests to wander among carefully manicured paths and elaborate topiaries. Henry had arrived late, fulfilling his promise to make an appearance, but planning to depart as quickly as propriety allowed. He found Penelope standing alone near an ornamental fountain, a book open in her hands. The Dowager Countess was engaged in conversation with the Duchess some distance away, leaving her companion temporarily unobserved. Henry approached quietly, curious to see what she was reading. "Mr. Wordsworth's works," he observed, and watched her start, the book nearly slipping from her grasp. "I did not take you for a devotee of modern verse, Miss Wright." Penelope recovered quickly, marking her place with one finger, and looking up at him with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "I did not take you for someone who paid attention to the reading habits of companions, my lord." It was possibly the most direct thing she had ever said to him, and Henry smiled despite himself at the spark of spirit in her voice. "I find," he said carefully, "that my assumptions about many things have proven remarkably inaccurate of late. Might I join you for a moment?" He saw the calculation in her expression, the weighing of consequences. To refuse would be to risk offending him further, but to accept might invite exactly the sort of gossip that could destroy what little security she possessed. "As you wish, my lord," she said finally. And he interpreted the formality of her response correctly. This was not a welcome invitation, but an accepted command. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sound of the fountain providing a gentle accompaniment to the distant chatter of the other guests. Henry searched for words, an unusual experience for someone who had always relied on easy charm and cutting wit. "I have been making inquiries," he said at last, "about your father. Arthur Wright, the dancing master." He saw her entire body tense, saw the way her fingers tightened on the book until the leather binding creaked beneath the pressure. "Have you indeed, my lord? And what stories have reached your ears? That he was a drunkard, a gambler, a thief? I assure you, society has invented many colorful versions of his fall from grace, each more lurid than the last." "Actually," Henry said quietly, and the gentleness in his voice seemed to surprise them both, "I learned that Arthur Wright was considered the finest teacher of his generation, that he trained dancers for the opera house, as well as teaching the daughters of the nobility, that his technique was based on mathematical principles and continental training that he had acquired during years of study abroad." Penelope's head turned slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. "Go on." "I also learned that he contracted consumption, that he spent his final years teaching despite his illness because he had a daughter to support, and that he died owing money to several families, not because he gambled, but because he continued to provide lessons even when his students' parents refused to pay, knowing he was too ill to pursue legal remedy." The silence that followed was profound. Penelope's eyes had filled with tears that she refused to allow to fall, her jaw clenched tight against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her careful control. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you trouble yourself to learn the truth about a man of no consequence, about a companion who matters to no one?" Henry looked out across the manicured gardens, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment, with the vulnerability he had not intended to expose. "Because I am beginning to suspect that I have been a fool, Miss Wright, and while I am accustomed to being many things, a fool is not among them." Before either of them could say more, the Dowager Countess's voice rang out across the garden, summoning Penelope to attend her. The moment shattered like glass, and Penelope dropped into a quick curtsy before hurrying away, leaving Henry alone beside the fountain with a book of poetry lying forgotten on the stone bench. He picked it up, intending to return it, and a small piece of paper fell from between the pages. A list, written in a careful, educated hand, household accounts, small sums noted beside each entry, carefully tallied at the bottom. Henry studied the numbers and realized with a jolt that he was looking at Penelope's attempts to tally her meager wages, calculating how much she could save each month toward some unknown future goal. The amounts were heartbreakingly small. Her entire quarterly wage would not purchase a single bottle of fine brandy. Henry tucked the paper back into the book and carried it with him when he left the garden party, a tangible reminder of realities he had never before troubled himself to contemplate. The investigation by his solicitor arrived a fortnight later, a thick packet of papers that confirmed what Henry had already begun to suspect. Arthur Wright had been precisely what Penelope claimed, a master of his craft brought low by illness and the casual cruelty of those who saw him as beneath them. The debts attributed to gambling were actually medical expenses and payments made to other teachers who had agreed to take his students when he became too ill to continue. More damningly, the investigation revealed that many of the rumors about Arthur Wright's character had originated with a single source, a former student's mother who had objected to paying her bill and had started the whispers to justify her dishonest refusal to pay. That woman's name appeared in the solicitor's letter as Lady Margaret Hartwell, Constance's mother. Henry sat in his study, the papers spread before him, and felt the last remnants of his certainty crumble. He had been cruel to Penelope Wright at the ball, yes, but his cruelty had been merely the latest in a long line of injuries that society had inflicted upon her and her father. He had mocked her for entertainment, never considering that she was already broken by years of grinding poverty and social exile. And his cousin had known. Constance had known the truth about Arthur Wright and had deliberately twisted it to serve her own purposes, to poison Henry against Penelope and ensure that he would choose humiliation over honor. The fury that rose in Henry at this realization was cold and calculating. The anger of a man who had discovered he had been manipulated by someone he had trusted. He had allowed Constance liberties based on their family connection, had treated her with a familiarity that she had clearly interpreted as something more. and she had responded by attempting to destroy an innocent woman to secure her own position. This, Henry decided, would not stand. That evening he penned 2 letters. The first was to his mother, informing her that he had made his decision regarding Miss Penelope Wright, and that he would appreciate her attendance at Ravenscroft House the following morning to discuss the particulars. The second was to the Dowager Countess of Helmsley, requesting a private interview with Miss Wright at her earliest convenience. Both letters were dispatched before he could reconsider, sealed with his signet, and sent into the London night to set in motion events that could not be recalled. The Dowager Countess responded first, her note arriving the following morning with a speed that suggested she had anticipated such a request. She granted permission for Henry to call upon Helmsley House that afternoon, with the caveat that she would be present during the interview as propriety demanded. Henry arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, the hour appointed for morning calls, though the sun stood well past its zenith. The butler, who had witnessed the infamous waltz, showed him into a small receiving room decorated in shades of blue and gold, where the Dowager Countess sat in state like an ancient queen granting audience. "Lord Ravenscroft," she said, her voice creaking with age but her eyes sharp as ever. "I confess I am most curious to learn the purpose of this visit." "Your Grace," Henry bowed respectfully, using the courtesy title she had earned through her late husband's rank. "I come to request a private conversation with Miss Wright regarding the promise I made at your ball 2 weeks past." "Private?" The Dowager's eyebrows rose nearly to her elaborate lace cap. "My lord, surely you understand that such a conversation would be most irregular. Miss Wright is under my protection, and I will not have her subjected to further humiliation." "I understand entirely, Your Grace, which is why I am pleased to accept your presence during our conversation. I ask only that Miss Wright be permitted to speak freely, without fear of consequence to her position in your household." The Dowager studied him for a long moment, her ancient face revealing nothing of her thoughts. Finally, she rang the small bell that sat on the table beside her chair. "Send Miss Wright to me," she instructed the maid who appeared, "and inform her that Lord Ravenscroft requests her presence." They waited in silence, Henry standing by the window overlooking the small garden behind the townhouse, the Dowager watching him with the patience of someone who had outlived 3 husbands and most of her enemies. When Penelope finally entered, her grey gown perfectly pressed and her hair arranged in a simple knot, Henry felt something twist in his chest at the carefully blank expression she wore like armor. "You sent for me, Your Grace?" Penelope's voice was steady, but Henry noticed the way her hands clasped tightly at her waist, knuckles white with tension. "Lord Ravenscroft wishes to speak with you, child," the Dowager said gently. "About the events of the ball I shall remain present, but you are free to speak your mind without fear. You have my word that your position here is secure, regardless of what is said in this room." Penelope's eyes flew to her mistress's face, surprise and gratitude warring in her expression, before she schooled her features back to neutrality. She turned to face Henry, and he saw her gathering her courage like a warrior preparing for battle. "Miss Wright," Henry began, then stopped, frustrated by the formality that seemed suddenly ridiculous given the circumstances. "Penelope. May I call you Penelope?" "As you wish, my lord." Her voice held no inflection, gave nothing away. Henry took a breath and plunged forward. "I have spent the past 2 weeks making inquiries into your father's history and the circumstances of his death. I have learned things that shame me about the way society treated a skilled artisan who deserved better. I have also learned that certain rumors about his character were deliberately constructed by individuals with malicious intent." He saw the flicker of emotion cross her face before she controlled it. "I see. And having learned these things, you have come to what purpose, my lord? To apologize for believing lies, to offer some small compensation before you formally retract your promise and leave me to face whatever consequences your public humiliation has wrought." The bitterness in her voice cut deeper than he had expected. Henry moved closer, stopping only when propriety demanded he maintain a respectful distance. "I have come," he said, "to ask your forgiveness for my cruelty, and to offer you a choice that is yours alone to make, free from coercion or consequence." Penelope's lips parted in surprise, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. My promise was made as a jest, intended to humiliate you for my own entertainment. This is indefensible, and I will not insult your intelligence by claiming otherwise. Yet, the promise was made before witnesses, and regardless of my intent, it now exists as a debt of honor. Debt of honor, Penelope repeated, and something like a laugh escaped her, sharp and without humor. My lord, we both know that promises made to companions carry no weight in law or society. You are free to walk away from your jest without consequence. Perhaps, Henry allowed, but I find that I'm not free to walk away from what I have learned about you, about your father, about the way you have been treated by people who should have known better. I find that I am, despite my every expectation, unable to dismiss you as I once would have done. The Dowager Countess made a small sound, quickly suppressed, and Henry glanced at her to find the old woman watching them with an expression of dawning comprehension. "What are you saying, Lord Ravenscroft?" Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am saying that I wish to honor my promise, if you will accept it. Not because I am bound by the letter of my jest, but because I choose to be bound by something I am only beginning to understand." Henry paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "I am saying that I wish to court you properly, Penelope Wright. To learn who you are beyond the grey gown and downcast eyes, to discover if the woman who danced that waltz with such devastating skill might be someone worth knowing." The silence that followed was absolute. Penelope stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language, her expression cycling through disbelief, suspicion, and finally, something that might have been hope before she crushed it ruthlessly beneath years of learned caution. "You wish to court me," she said flatly. "A penniless companion with a dead father and no prospects. You, Viscount Ravenscroft, wish to enter into formal courtship with someone the society you move in considers beneath notice." "Yes," Henry said simply. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty, rejecting pretty lies or easy flattery. Henry answered with more truth than he had intended. "Because you danced as if music lived in your bones, and when you looked at me afterward, I saw not triumph but dignity, because you have survived 6 years of casual cruelty with your spirit intact, because my cousin attempted to poison me against you using lies about your father, and I find myself more angry at her manipulation than I have been about anything in years." He took another step closer, knowing he was pushing the boundaries of propriety, but unable to stop himself. "Because I am 30 years old and have spent a decade entertaining myself with cruel jests and empty pleasures, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I find myself wanting to be someone better, someone worthy of the way you refuse to let this world break you." Penelope's eyes had filled with tears again, and this time she did not stop them from falling, silver tracks sliding down her pale cheeks. The Dowager Countess rose from her chair with surprising swiftness, crossing to Penelope and taking her hands in a grip that looked gentle, but Henry suspected was quite firm. "Child," the old woman said softly, "you need not answer now. You need not answer at all, if you do not wish it. But I will tell you this. I have known Henry Beaumont since he was a boy in short pants, and I have never heard him speak with such honesty about anything. Whatever you decide, you have my support absolutely." Penelope looked at her mistress, then back at Henry, then down at her own hands clasped in the Dowager's papery grip. When she spoke, her voice was thick with tears, but surprisingly steady. "I do not understand this. Any of this. 2 weeks ago you mocked me in front of half of London. Now you stand in this room and speak of courtship and honor, as if I am someone deserving of such consideration. How can I possibly know which version of you is real?" "I do not know," Henry admitted. "I do not know which version is real, or if some third version exists that I have not yet discovered. But I would very much like the opportunity to find out, and I hope you will grant me the chance to prove that the man who spoke cruelly at the ball was the jest, and this, what I offer now, is the truth." Penelope was quiet for so long that Henry began to fear she would refuse outright. Finally she raised her head, meeting his gaze with those steady brown eyes that had haunted his thoughts for 2 weeks. "If I permit this courtship, what happens to my position here? I cannot afford to lose my place, my lord. I have no family, no other prospects. If this proves to be another of your jests, I must not be left with nothing." "Your position is secure," the dowager interjected before Henry could respond. "That I promise you, Penelope. Regardless of what transpires with Lord Ravenscroft, you have a home here for as long as you wish it." Henry nodded his agreement. "And I will have my solicitor draw up documents guaranteeing you an income should anything prevent our courtship from reaching its natural conclusion. You will not be left vulnerable because you granted me the grace of a second chance." "Very well," Penelope said, and Henry felt something in his chest loosen at her words. "Very well, Lord Ravenscroft. I will accept your courtship, but I warn you now, I am not some malleable creature to be shaped according to your preferences. I am Arthur Wright's daughter, and he taught me that dignity and skill are their own forms of nobility. If you seek someone who will simper and flatter, you have chosen poorly." Henry smiled despite himself, a genuine expression that felt foreign after years of cynical sneers. "Miss Wright, if I had wanted simpering and flattery, I could have chosen from a dozen willing candidates. I find that I prefer honesty and backbone, even when, especially when, it makes me uncomfortable." "Then we understand each other," Penelope replied, and something in her expression shifted, became slightly less guarded. "When do we begin this unusual courtship?" "Tomorrow," Henry said decisively. "I shall call upon you here at 3 o'clock, and we shall take a drive through Hyde Park during the promenade hour. Let society see that I am in earnest about this, and let them say what they will." The Dowager Countess clapped her hands together once, a sharp sound that made both younger people jump. "Excellent. Then I suggest you depart now, Lord Ravenscroft, before propriety is further strained. And you, Penelope, should rest. Tomorrow will be trying enough without exhausting yourself with worry tonight." Henry bowed to them both and took his leave, feeling simultaneously lighter and more terrified than he could remember being in years. He had set something in motion that could not be easily stopped, had made promises that honor would demand he keep, and he found, to his surprise, that he did not regret any of it. But London society, as he would discover over the following weeks, was not prepared to simply accept his decision without resistance. The drive through Hyde Park the next day was precisely as challenging as Henry had anticipated, and somehow worse. They departed from Helmsley House in his curricle, a sporting vehicle that allowed him to drive himself rather than rely on a coachman, with Penelope seated beside him in the same grey gown she had worn the day before, her only concession to the occasion a shawl of Norwich silk that the dowager had insisted she borrow. To preserve propriety, Henry's groom stood stoically on the back of the vehicle, his presence a silent chaperone, forcing Henry and Penelope to speak in hushed tones to avoid being overheard by the servant. The promenade hour brought out every member of the ton who wished to see and be seen, and news of Viscount Ravenscroft's intended drive with the dowager's companion had spread through London, drawing rooms like fire through dry timber. The paths through Hyde Park were crowded with carriages moving at a ceremonial pace, and Henry felt the weight of countless eyes upon them as he guided his horses into the procession. "Steady," he murmured to Penelope, though whether he was reassuring her or himself remained unclear. "They will stare and whisper, but we need only maintain our composure and refuse to acknowledge their rudeness." "I am accustomed to being stared at, my lord," Penelope replied, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture perfect despite the attention, "though generally it is the staring one reserves for unpleasant surprises or unfortunate accidents, not for people." Her dry observation startled a laugh from Henry, and he saw several nearby ladies gasp at the sound, scandalized by the apparent levity of the moment. "Let them gasp," he thought, with grim satisfaction. "Let them see that I am not ashamed to be seen with this woman." They had completed perhaps half the circuit when Lady Constance's barouche appeared ahead of them, her mother, Lady Margaret, seated beside her in magnificent purple silk that screamed both wealth and self-importance. Henry felt Penelope tense beside him and reached across to touch her hand briefly in reassurance before propriety demanded he return his attention to his horses. "Cousin Henry," Constance called out as their carriages drew parallel, "how delightful to encounter you, and Miss Wright, of course. Such an unexpected pleasure to see you taking the air." The false sweetness in her voice made Henry's jaw clench, but he responded with matching politeness. "Constance, Lady Margaret, I trust you are enjoying this fine weather." "Indeed," Lady Margaret interjected, her sharp eyes fixed on Penelope with predatory interest. "Though we were just remarking on the curious nature of recent events, it seems some people have rather inflated opinions of their own importance, inspired perhaps by momentary attention from their betters." Henry felt fury rise in his throat, but before he could form a cutting response, Penelope spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the space between the carriages. "Lady Margaret, how kind of you to concern yourself with the opinions of those beneath your notice. One might think you had nothing more pressing to occupy your thoughts than the affairs of insignificant companions. I confess I find that remarkably generous, given how very busy you must be with your own matters." The words were perfectly polite, the tone utterly respectful, but the barb beneath them was unmistakable. Lady Margaret's face flushed an unbecoming red, and Constance's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I am not certain what you are implying, Miss Wright," Lady Margaret said coldly, "but I would advise you to remember your place before you speak so boldly to your betters." "Oh, I remember my place quite well, my lady," Penelope replied, still in that same pleasant tone. "My father taught me to recognize the difference between true nobility and mere titles. One is earned through character and integrity, the other is simply inherited." Henry, aware that half the park was now watching their exchange with rapt attention, decided it was time to intervene before the situation escalated further. "If you will excuse us, ladies," he said firmly, encouraging his horses forward with a subtle flick of the reins. "We have an engagement for which we cannot be late." As they pulled away, he heard Constance's voice rise in indignation behind them, but he refused to look back. Beside him, Penelope sat rigid, her face pale but her expression composed. "That was remarkably brave," Henry observed, "and remarkably foolish. You have made an enemy who will not forget or forgive such a public slight." "She was already my enemy," Penelope responded, her hands still perfectly folded, but he could see the tremor in her fingers. "She has been spreading poison about my father for weeks, whispering lies to anyone who will listen. I apologize if my defense has complicated your position, my lord, but I will not allow her to dishonor Arthur Wright's memory without response." Henry reached across again, this time covering her trembling hands with one of his own in a gesture that was probably too familiar for a public setting, but which he could not seem to prevent. "Your defense has not complicated my position, Penelope. If anything, it has clarified matters considerably, and I think perhaps it is time I shared with you what my investigation revealed about the origins of the rumors concerning your father." He told her then, as they completed their circuit through the park, about the unpaid bill and Lady Margaret's role in destroying Arthur Wright's reputation. He told her about the letters his solicitor had uncovered, the correspondence between Lady Margaret and several other society matrons, deliberately coordinating their whispers to ensure maximum damage. By the time he finished, Penelope's hands had stopped trembling, replaced by a rigid fury that Henry found oddly magnificent. "She killed him," Penelope said, her voice low and intense. "The stress of losing his students, the financial burden, the shame of being accused of dishonesty when he was the most honest man I have ever known. It hastened his decline, made his last months a torment of worry and guilt. Lady Margaret Hartwell killed my father, as surely as if she had struck him down with her own hands." "Yes," Henry agreed, "she did, and I intend to ensure that London society learns the truth of it." Penelope turned to look at him, her brown eyes searching his face for deception or hidden motive. "Why? Why would you involve yourself in such matters? Exposing Lady Margaret will create a scandal that reflects on your cousin as well. Constance will be damaged by association. Constance attempted to manipulate me into abandoning you by using lies about your father that she knew to be false," Henry said flatly. "She is as guilty as her mother in this matter, and I will not allow either of them to escape consequence simply because we share blood." They had reached the edge of the park, approaching the gates that would return them to the regular London streets. Henry guided his horses through the opening, then turned them not toward Helmsley House but in the opposite direction. "Where are we going?" Penelope asked, though her tone held more curiosity than concern. Ravenscroft House, Henry replied. My mother is expecting us for tea, and I believe it is time you were properly introduced to the family you may be joining. He felt Penelope stiffen beside him. My lord, surely you jest. Your mother will never accept me. I am nobody, nothing, a companion whose father died in disgrace. You are Arthur Wright's daughter, Henry corrected firmly. You are a woman who dances with such skill that you silenced a ballroom full of critics. You are someone with courage enough to accept an impossible challenge and grace enough to speak truth to those who consider themselves your betters. And you are the woman I am courting with serious intent. My mother will accept you, or she will discover that I am far more stubborn than she has previously had cause to believe. The tea with his mother did not begin well. The Dowager Viscountess Ravenscroft received them in her private sitting room at the townhouse, her expression carved from ice and her posture radiating disapproval. She acknowledged Penelope with the barest nod courtesy demanded, then turned her attention entirely to her son. Henry, I do hope you have come to your senses about this untenable situation. I have been consulting with our solicitor, and he assures me there are several grounds upon which we could successfully argue that your promise was made under conditions that render it non-binding. Mother, Henry said with steel beneath the gentleness, allow me to introduce you properly to Miss Penelope Wright, daughter of the late Arthur Wright, who was dancing master to some of the finest families in England. Miss Wright, my mother, Viscountess Ravenscroft. Penelope rose and executed a perfect curtsy, her grey gown in stark contrast to the elaborate furnishings of the sitting room. Your ladyship, thank you for receiving me in your home. The dowager regarded her coldly for a long moment, then shifted her gaze back to Henry. Respectfully performed, I grant, but manners do not constitute grounds for marriage to a viscount, my son. You cannot seriously intend to proceed with this farce. It is not a farce, Henry replied, settling into the chair across from his mother and gesturing for Penelope to take the seat beside him. I am courting Miss Wright with every intention of honoring my promise should she accept me. I thought it appropriate to inform you of this decision in person and to request that you treat my intended bride with the respect her position merits. Intended bride, his mother repeated, and something dangerous flickered in her eyes. Henry, do you comprehend what you are suggesting? This woman has no connections, no fortune, no family of consequence. She cannot help you politically or socially. She brings nothing to this union save a pretty face and some skill at dancing, both of which can be found in abundance among girls with actual pedigrees. Henry felt Penelope tense beside him, but when he glanced at her, her expression remained composed, though her eyes had gone dark with hurt. She brings integrity, Henry said, his voice hardening. She brings dignity and courage and a strength of character that shames most of the pampered heiresses you would prefer I consider. And she brings the example of a father who maintained his honor even when society stripped him of everything else. Yes, let us discuss her father, his mother said with cold precision. Arthur Wright, who died owing money across half of London, who was whispered to have questionable associations and even more questionable methods of extracting payment from his students. Arthur Wright, Penelope said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, was slandered by Lady Margaret Hartwell because she refused to pay him for lessons delivered to her daughter. Every rumor you have heard about his character was deliberately constructed by that woman to justify her dishonest refusal to pay. Lord Ravenscroft's solicitor has documentation proving this, if you care to examine it. The dowager's eyebrows rose, the first crack in her icy composure. Documentation? Henry leaned forward, placing a sheaf of papers on the low table between them. Letters between Lady Margaret and several other society matrons, coordinating their scandalous tales. Records from Father's bank, showing that the only debts Arthur Wright owed at his death were medical expenses and loans he had taken to care for his dying daughter. He corrected himself quickly, or rather, to care for his daughter who later recovered. He caught Penelope's quick glance of gratitude at not being characterized as dying. Testimonials from the opera house masters who trained with him, confirming his skill and integrity, and a rather damning letter from Lady Margaret's own former housekeeper, whom I located and interviewed personally, describing how her mistress boasted of ruining Wright's reputation. The Dowager Viscountess took the papers with obvious reluctance and began to read. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the soft tick of the mantel clock. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from cold disapproval to something more complex. "If this is true," she said slowly, "then Lady Margaret Hartwell has committed a grievous wrong. But that does not necessarily mean that you must marry her victim's daughter in recompense, Henry." "I am not marrying Penelope in recompense," Henry replied, and he realized as he spoke that he was using her first name without thinking, that some barrier between them had dissolved during their drive through the park. "I am marrying her because I choose to do so, because I find her worthy of that choice, and because I will not allow the cruelty of others to dictate the course of my life." His mother studied him for a long moment, her shrewd gaze moving between her son and the quiet young woman in the grey gown. Finally, she sighed, a sound that held decades of managing the complexities of social position and family obligation. "Very well," she said, and Henry barely managed to conceal his shock at the concession. "If you are determined on this course, then I will not stand in your way. But understand that society will not simply accept this match without resistance. There will be scandal, gossip, doors that close to you both. Are you prepared for that, Miss Wright?" Penelope met the dowager's gaze steadily. "Your ladyship, I have been the subject of gossip and the recipient of closed doors for 6 years. I am accustomed to both, and while I cannot claim to enjoy them, neither do they hold the power to destroy me. Your son's reputation may suffer, and that concerns me greatly, but my own position can hardly decline further than it already stands." Something like respect flickered across the dowager's face. "You are pragmatic, at least. That is a quality many young women lack." She paused, then continued with visible effort. "If Henry is intent on this match, and if you are willing to accept him despite the irregular circumstances of his proposal, then I will do what I can to ease your entry into society as Viscountess Ravenscroft. It will not be easy, and there will be many who refuse to acknowledge you, but you will have my support. However, Henry, be warned, if this scandal damages our political standing beyond repair, you will have only yourself to blame." It was not a warm welcome, but it was acknowledgement, and Henry recognized it as a victory far greater than he had any right to expect. The weeks that followed tested them all in ways Henry had not anticipated. He called upon Penelope daily at Helmsley House, took her driving in the park, escorted her and the Dowager Countess to carefully selected social events where he could provide protection from the worst of society's cruelty. And with each interaction, he found himself increasingly convinced that his impulsive decision to honor his promise was perhaps the sanest choice he had made in years. Penelope was not like the society misses he had danced with and dismissed. She read voraciously, had opinions on everything from the Corn Laws to Byron's poetry, and possessed a dry wit that caught him off guard repeatedly. She was also achingly vulnerable in moments when she thought he was not observing her, flinching from loud voices, instinctively making herself small when confronted by groups of ladies whose whispers followed her like arrows. Henry found himself growing increasingly protective, a response that surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. When Lord Ashbury made a crude jest about companions and their willingness to trade services for security, Henry's response was swift and brutal, issuing a challenge that forced Ashbury to retract his words and offer public apology or face social ruin. When Lady Caroline Whitmore deliberately spilled wine on Penelope's borrowed gown at a dinner party, Henry ensured that every host in London received word of the incident, resulting in Lady Caroline's invitations drying up for the remainder of the season. And when Constance attempted one final attack, spreading rumors that Penelope had deliberately entrapped him through some sort of trickery or seduction, Henry responded by taking Penelope to the theatre on the most public night of the season, seating her in his private box where all could see, and treating her with such obvious respect and affection that even the most determined gossips were forced to reconsider their scandalous tales. But the true test came 6 weeks into their courtship, at a ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Richmond, arguably the most influential couple in London society after the royal family itself. Their invitation to both Henry and Penelope was seen as a watershed moment, the point at which society would either accept or definitively reject the match. Henry arrived at Helmsley House to collect Penelope and found her waiting in the entrance hall in a gown that stole his breath, Gone was the grey muslin of the companion. In its place she wore a creation of ivory silk with a subtle overlay of gold lace, the dowager's gift from her own extensive wardrobe, altered to fit Penelope's slighter frame. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style that revealed the graceful column of her neck, and she wore a simple pearl necklace that had been Henry's grandmother's. "You look," Henry began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to the moment. "You look like yourself, but somehow more so, as if you have been hiding in grey shadows and have finally stepped into the light." Penelope smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her serious face into something radiant. The dowager insisted. She said that if I am to be introduced as your intended bride, I must look the part, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes me feel to wear silk that costs more than I earned in a year of service. "You are no longer a servant," Henry said gently, offering her his arm. "You are Miss Penelope Wright, and soon, if you will accept me, you will be Viscountess Ravenscroft. The silk is merely acknowledging what was always true." They arrived at Richmond House to find it ablaze with light, the drive crowded with carriages disgorging guests in their finest evening attire. Henry felt Penelope's hand tighten on his arm as they approached the entrance, and he covered her fingers with his own in reassurance. "Courage," he murmured. "We face this together, and I will not allow anyone to harm you." The Duke and Duchess of Richmond received them with careful courtesy, neither warm nor cold, making no comment on the unusual circumstances of their courtship, but acknowledging Penelope with the respect due to a viscount's intended bride. It was a masterful display of diplomatic neutrality, and Henry felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as they moved into the ballroom. But he had not accounted for the fact that Constance would be present, or that she would choose this night to make her final, desperate play. They had been at the ball for perhaps an hour. Henry engaged in conversation with several of his friends, while Penelope stood quietly beside him, when Constance's voice rang out across the ballroom with devastating clarity. "I simply cannot remain silent any longer," she announced, her beautiful face flushed with champagne and calculated malice. "I have tried to protect my cousin from his own foolishness, tried to warn him about the scheming fortune hunter who has ensnared him, but he refuses to listen to reason." The ballroom fell silent, every conversation dying as guests turned to stare at the spectacle unfolding. Henry felt fury rise in his chest, but before he could move, Constance continued. "Miss Wright is not what she appears, no matter how pretty she looks in borrowed finery. Her father was a charlatan who stole from the families foolish enough to trust him. She herself has admitted to accepting payment for services rendered, and I have witnesses who will swear that she deliberately engineered the circumstances of that infamous waltz to trap my cousin into a promise he made in jest." Penelope had gone deathly pale beside Henry, her hand falling away from his arm. He saw her gathering herself to flee, to escape from this fresh humiliation, and he knew in that moment that if he did not act decisively, if he did not choose her absolutely and publicly right now, he would lose her forever. "That is quite enough, Constance," Henry said, his voice cutting through the shocked whispers with icy precision. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Penelope and his cousin, and when he spoke again, every word carried across the silent ballroom. "You speak of scheming and fortune-hunting, cousin, but the only schemer I see in this room is you. You have spent weeks attempting to poison society against an innocent woman because you harbored the mistaken belief that you had some claim upon my affections. You were wrong." He turned, moving back to Penelope and taking her cold hands in his. "Miss Wright has never asked me for anything. She accepted my courtship with reluctance, warned me repeatedly that I would face social consequences, and has borne the cruelty of society with more dignity than most of the people in this room would be capable of managing." Facing the assembled guests, Henry raised his voice to ensure every person present could hear him clearly. "Her father, Arthur Wright, was slandered by Lady Margaret Hartwell to avoid paying an honest debt. I have documentation proving this, which I will happily share. The rumors about his character were lies, deliberately constructed by Constance's own mother." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lady Margaret herself, standing near the entrance, went white as snow. Henry continued relentlessly. "As for Miss Wright entrapping me, I suggest that anyone who believes such nonsense consider the reality of what occurred. I, drunk on champagne and cruelty, publicly mocked a woman who had never harmed me. She accepted my impossible challenge and met it with such skill that she silenced every critic in the room. The only person trapped by the events of that night was me. Trapped by my own arrogance and forced to confront the ugliness of my own character. He turned back to Penelope, who was staring at him with tears streaming down her face, and dropped to one knee in front of the entire assembly. Penelope Wright, you have given me the grace of your presence these past weeks, allowed me the privilege of learning who you truly are beneath the grey gowns and careful silence. You have shown me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate your actions. You have taught me that dignity can survive any assault, and that love, real love, is a choice one makes every day. The ballroom was utterly silent now, every guest transfixed by the scene unfolding. "But I'm asking you anyway," Henry said, his voice dropping to something more intimate though still audible to those closest. "Will you marry me? Not because I promised in jest, not because society expects it, but because I choose you, because I want to spend the rest of my life learning to be worthy of the faith you have shown in accepting my courtship." Penelope was openly crying now, years of compressed emotion finally breaking free. "You should not do this," she whispered, though her words carried in the profound silence. "Your family, your position, everything you could lose." "I would lose far more by losing you," Henry replied. "Everything else is just noise, Penelope. You are the melody I have been waiting to hear." For a long moment she simply stared at him, this man who had been her tormentor and had transformed into something she had never dared dream possible. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, and her voice gained strength as she repeated it. "Yes, Henry Beaumont, I will marry you. God help us both, but I will marry you." Henry rose, pulling her into an embrace that was probably scandalous given the setting, but which he could not prevent. Chaos broke loose in the ballroom, some guests applauding, others whispering furiously, Lady Margaret fainting with theatrical timing, and Constance fleeing in tears. But Henry and Penelope remained locked together at the center of the storm, two people who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances and chosen, against all odds and societal expectations, to build something real from the ruins of a cruel jest. The Duke of Richmond approached them as the chaos began to settle, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he observed dryly, "I must confess that was the most entertaining proposal I have witnessed in my 40 years of attending society balls. I do hope you both plan to continue providing such excellent entertainment after your marriage." "Your Grace," Penelope managed, still clinging to Henry as if he were the only solid thing in a suddenly spinning world, "please forgive the disruption to your evening." "My dear Miss Wright," the Duke replied with genuine warmth, "you have just provided my guests with a story they will recount over supper for the next decade. I should be thanking you for ensuring this ball will be remembered as something more than another tedious social obligation." His words were a benediction, a signal to the assembled guests that the Duke of Richmond, at least, found nothing objectionable in the match. Other guests, taking their cue from their host, began to approach with congratulations, and Henry watched as Penelope transformed again, this time from hunted creature into something approaching confidence. They married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that was small by aristocratic standards, but larger than Henry had originally intended. His mother, true to her word, had smoothed some of the rougher edges of society's resistance, though many of the higher sticklers still refused to attend. The Dowager Countess of Helmsley stood as Penelope's witness, weeping openly throughout the ceremony, and even Lord Marcus Fairfax appeared, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire, but grinning when Henry caught his eye. Constance and Lady Margaret were notably absent, having fled London for their country estate after the scandal at Richmond House had exploded into open knowledge. The papers Henry's solicitor had uncovered regarding Arthur Wright's character were circulated through society, and the resulting damage to the Hartwell family reputation was severe enough that Lady Margaret would spend years attempting to rebuild it. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenscroft House, and as Henry watched his bride move through the assembled guests with increasing ease, he felt something in his chest that had been frozen for years finally begin to thaw. Later, after the guests had departed, and they had retreated to the privacy of the chambers that were now theirs, Penelope turned to him with an expression he had learned to recognize as her gathering courage for something difficult. "What troubles you?" he asked gently, drawing her to sit beside him on the settee near the fireplace. "I am trying to understand how we arrived here," she admitted. 6 weeks ago, I was a companion in a grey gown, invisible to everyone including myself. Now I am Viscountess Ravenscroft, married to a man who once mocked me and who now claims to love me. The transformation is so complete that I fear I will wake to find it was all a dream." Henry took her hands in his, noting absently that she no longer wore gloves indoors, a small freedom she had claimed since moving into his household. "It is no dream," he assured her, "though I grant you the speed of our journey from that disastrous waltz to this moment defies reason. But I think perhaps that is the nature of real transformation. It happens not gradually, but in moments of crisis, when we are forced to choose between the comfortable lie and the uncomfortable truth." "And what truth did you choose?" Penelope asked, her brown eyes searching his face in the firelight. "That I had become something ugly," Henry replied honestly. "That my wealth and position had insulated me from consequence for so long that I had forgotten how to see other people as real, as worthy of consideration beyond their value as entertainment. That waltz forced me to see you, truly see you, and in seeing you I was forced to see myself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I did not like what I saw. So I chose to change. I chose to make inquiries rather than dismiss. I chose to defend rather than attack. I chose to honor a promise made in cruelty, because keeping it felt like the only way to prove that I could be better than I had been." Penelope was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words. Then she smiled, that radiant expression that still had the power to steal his breath. "Then I suppose we both made choices, you and I. You chose to become someone worthy of respect. I chose to believe that such transformation was possible. Perhaps that is enough to build a life upon." "Perhaps," Henry agreed, pulling her closer. "Though I suspect we will have many more choices ahead of us, many more moments where we must decide who we wish to be. But I find I am content to face them together." 5 years later, as Henry had promised Penelope on their wedding night, they had faced many such choices and made them together. The Viscountess, as she was now known throughout London, had established a school for young girls whose circumstances had left them without resources or prospects. The school offered instruction in ciphering and literature, alongside music and the practical skills that would allow the students to support themselves with dignity. It was housed in a respectable townhouse Henry had purchased in Bloomsbury, far enough from Mayfair to avoid direct conflict with the ton, but respectable enough that the students need not feel shame in attending. Penelope oversaw the instruction personally, perpetuating her father's techniques and ensuring that Arthur Wright's legacy lived on in the graceful movements of girls who might otherwise have been lost to poverty and ruin. The school had become surprisingly fashionable among certain enlightened members of society who appreciated the combination of practical education and artistic training. Even some families who had initially snubbed the Beaumonts over their unconventional marriage had softened when they saw the good Penelope was accomplishing. Henry, for his part, had discovered that being married to someone who challenged him intellectually and ethically was far more interesting than the empty pleasures that had occupied his bachelor years. He took his seat in the House of Lords more seriously, championed several bills aimed at improving the condition of the labouring classes, and became someone he could respect when he looked in the mirror each morning. They had 2 children, a daughter named Eleanor after Penelope's mother, and a son called Arthur for the grandfather he would never meet. Both children were being raised with an awareness of how fragile security could be, how quickly fortune could turn, and how important it was to treat all people with dignity, regardless of their station. On the 5th anniversary of that infamous waltz, Henry and Penelope attended a ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Richmond, who had become genuine friends over the intervening years. The ballroom was as crowded as it had been that night when Henry had knelt to propose, though the faces had changed somewhat as new generations made their debuts and old scandals faded into memory. "Do you remember?" Henry asked Penelope as they stood near the refreshment table, watching the dancers swirl past in elaborate patterns. Every moment, she replied, slipping her hand into his with the easy intimacy of long partnership. Though sometimes it seems like it happened to two different people. I can hardly recognize the frightened companion I was, or the cruel aristocrat you were. We are all wearers of many masks, I think, Henry mused. The question is which version we choose to feed, which we allow to grow strong and which we starve into insignificance. A young lady approached them hesitantly, a girl of perhaps 16 in her first season, her gown modest but well-made. She curtsied deeply to Penelope, ignoring Henry entirely in her nervousness. "Lady Ravenscroft," the girl stammered, "I attend your school in Bloomsbury. I wanted to thank you for the opportunities you have provided. My mother says I am to have a position as a governess with the Ashbury family, and it is only because of the education you made possible." Penelope smiled warmly, taking the girl's hands in greeting. "Sarah, how wonderful to see you here. I'm so pleased about your position. You have worked very hard and deserve every success." After Sarah departed, blushing with pleasure at being recognized, Henry pulled Penelope into the next waltz, claiming his wife for a dance as he had done at every ball they attended together. As they moved through the familiar patterns, their steps perfectly synchronized after years of practice, Henry found himself thinking about that first waltz, the one that had changed everything. How he had expected humiliation and received grace. How his cruelty had been transformed into something that looked remarkably like love. "What are you thinking?" Penelope asked, following his lead with the effortless skill that had first caught his attention 5 years earlier. "I was thinking that I made a promise in cruelty and kept it in love," Henry replied, "and that of all the foolish things I have done in my life, that promise was perhaps the wisest, because it brought me you." "You are becoming sentimental in your old age," Penelope teased, though her eyes were bright with emotion. 35, and already waxing poetic about fate and destiny. "I prefer to think of it as gaining wisdom through experience," Henry countered, "though I grant you that I was an exceptional fool to need such a dramatic lesson before recognizing what truly matters." The waltz carried them through its final movements, and as the music faded, Henry held Penelope a moment longer than strictly proper, neither of them ready to return to the mundane world beyond the dance floor. "I love you," he said, the words still new enough after 5 years that they felt precious each time he spoke them. "I choose you, every day, over every comfort and certainty that my former life promised." "And I love you," Penelope replied, rising on her toes to kiss him briefly, scandalizing several nearby matrons who still found the Beaumonts' open affection inappropriate for public settings. "I choose you too, you former fool who became something far better through determination and grace." They left the dance floor hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other something worth every sacrifice society had demanded. The impossible promise made in jest had become the foundation of something real, something lasting, something that had transformed them both in ways neither could have predicted. And somewhere in the crowded ballroom, a young companion in a grey gown watched them pass, hope kindling in her eyes at the sight of someone who had survived invisibility to claim a life worth living. Penelope noticed her, caught the girl's gaze, and smiled with recognition and encouragement before moving on. The cycle continued as all cycles must, but now there was a school in Bloomsbury where girls learned that grace and skill were indeed their own forms of nobility, where Arthur Wright's techniques lived on in the movements of those who might otherwise have been forgotten, where the daughter of a dancing master ensured that no one else would have to endure the invisibility she had suffered. The promise had been kept. The jest had become truth, and two people who had every reason to destroy each other had chosen instead to build something beautiful from the wreckage of pride and cruelty. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of Penelope and Henry's journey. If this story of transformation, courage, and love against all odds touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of hope and second chances.